What if I told you that you could get into law school without taking the LSAT? No logical reasoning, no reading comp, no test day nerves, you just get to apply straight up. If you're dreaming about that, that dream just got one step closer to reality. The American Bar Association, who are the gatekeepers of law school accreditation in the United States, they voted to let law schools apply for permission to go test optional. That means that theoretically, yes, a school could technically admit you to law school without your taking the LSAT. But before you get too excited, I want you to pause. Because the truth is, despite the headlines, this is not the end of the LSAT. It's the beginning of a slow, confusing, high stakes shift in how legal education works. And if you don't understand the nuances, you could end up making a mistake that costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars in scholarship money and could potentially keep you out of going to the law school that you really want. But we've got to get into the fine print here because this is where most students get tripped up. Here is what the American Bar Association actually did. They passed a rule that lets law schools apply for what is called a variance. A variance is just a fancy term for special permission. It's like asking for an exception to the normal rules. In this case, the American Bar Association is saying if you are a law school and you want to try admitting students without using a standardized test like the LSAT, go ahead, give it your best shot. We'll look at your case and decide if we're going to let you do it. If the law school is approved, then that school can admit students without any test score, but only for a limited time. I'm talking 3-5 years max. Then they have to either reapply to continue that variance or they go back to the old law school admissions rules, meaning they'll have to use a standardized test like the LSAT. Now, there are a few more things you got to know. First is this is not automatic. Law schools don't get to go test optional just because they want to. They have to apply for permission. They have to show they have a plan in place, and they have to show that their admissions process will be fair, transparent, and tied directly to student success. Also, not all law schools will qualify for going test optional. The American Bar Association isn't just going to rubber stamp every single request. Schools will need to explain how they will maintain academic standards, how they will support students without LSAT data, and how they will track outcomes like bar passage rates. This also is not a permanent change. The American Bar Association has made it clear this is a trial run. Think of it like a pilot program. If it goes well, they might consider expanding it in the future, but for now it is limited and it is experimental. And the LSAT is still allowed and still the default. Nothing says that law schools cannot use the LSAT. In fact, the overwhelming majority of law schools are still building their admissions decisions around the LSAT, even though they are not required to do so. So what this means is that those news headlines saying that the ABA has dropped the LSAT requirement are a bit misleading. They're not flipping a switch here. Schools are not tossing the LSAT in the trash overnight. What's really happening is this. The American Bar Association is opening the door just a crack to see what happens. They want to explore alternatives, they want to source more applicants, and they want to give schools room to innovate, but they're doing it carefully and under supervision. This is more like a controlled experiment than it is a revolution throwing off the shackles of the LSAT. And any smart law school applicant should be thinking, how do I play this to my advantage? And we'll get into that, but first let's talk about why the ABA is doing this at all. What's really behind this rule change is that the ABA wants to make law school more accessible. It's a lot more than just helping students or helping applicants. The ABA and law schools want to improve access and diversity to remove barriers that disproportionately affect students from underrepresented backgrounds, and the LSAT has been a target as a gatekeeper exam for a long time. There are plenty of critics of the LSAT who say it favors those who have time to study, who can afford expensive tutoring or prep courses, and those who already are familiar with standardized tests. And if I'm being really honest here, they're not wrong. Just like the SAT, the GRE, the GMAT, the MCAT, the LSAT, It is strongly correlated with access to resources, socioeconomic status, more than just raw potential. It is not a perfect test, and no test really is. And so the ABA is saying, let's at least give law schools the option to try something different. They're hoping that going test optional will open the doors to more students who've been historically shut out, especially first gen students and students from lower income families. And law schools are also nervous about enrollment trends. Enrollment is under pressure. While in the short term, law school applicant numbers are spiking, there is a coming demographic shift after the pandemic, after the recent economic uncertainty and inflation. And so applicant numbers will eventually trend down. And if that gets to a certain breaking point, law schools could face a real problem, because if there are fewer law school applicants, there's going to be lower tuition revenue for many schools, which leads to major financial stress. And so if you are a lower ranked school or a mid-tier law school and your applicant pool is shrinking, you look for ways to widen the funnel to increase applicant volume. And that's where the test optional movement comes in. It lets law schools say yes to students they might have otherwise rejected for having a low LSAT score, gives them a bigger pool to choose from, and that means more tuition dollars. And I'm not being cynical here. This is just business. Most law schools rely on tuition dollars, meaning they need students to survive. They need you more than you need them. And so the rule change going test optional gives law schools a way to do just that. And this is not happening in a vacuum. Other grad level programs like business school programs and even some med schools have gone test optional also, or at least played with it. And so the American Bar Association is feeling the pressure. They don't want to be seen as being stuck in the past. And so they want to keep up with the times and signal that they're open to change. Now, the LSAT is complicated. It's respected because it does offer a standardized way to compare students from different backgrounds, especially when GPAs vary wildly across schools and different majors. But it's also resented because it's high stakes, and for many students, the LSAT is completely unfamiliar. It's not like you studied it in college, right? And so for that reason, the LSATs become kind of a villain in the law school admissions process. And the goal here for the ABA is not to kill the LSAT entirely in response to criticism. They just want to see what happens without it. They're giving the schools options. And so despite all the headlines, what you want to do is you want to look at the trends, where things are going, and then make decisions for yourself based on the data. And so, again, look at what the law schools actually do, not just what the headlines say. When the ABA says that schools can apply to go test optional, it doesn't mean that most of them actually will, because what we've seen is that the vast majority of law schools are still sticking with the LSAT, because law school admissions is not just about admitting students one and done. You also got to look at the rankings impact, bar passage rates, and the reputation or prestige of the law school. If you look at top tier schools like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Cornell, Columbia, UChicago, NYU, the big brand names of legal education equivalent to the Ivy League, the T14, they live and die by their US News rankings, no matter how much they pretend not to care. And the rankings still factor in LSAT scores as a major component. If a school stopped requiring the LSAT, their ranking could drop. And if their ranking drops, they lose prestige, they lose top applicants, they lose donations from alums. And so even if they agree that the LSAT has flaws, they still see the LSAT as a valuable filter, because it lets them compare applicants from totally different academic backgrounds using the same yardstick. And so even if schools admit a small number of applicants without LSAT scores, most folks are still getting in with LSAT scores. If anything, these top schools are going to double down and push even harder for elite LSAT scorers. Then the lower ranked schools, the lowest ranked of all, for example, Cooley Law, for example, you might think they'd want to go test optional so they could admit more students and collect more tuition. But the problem is that while they might like to, these schools are under heavy pressure from the American Bar Association to maintain high bar passage rates. If too many of their graduates fail the bar exam, these schools risk losing their accreditation. So that would be an existential threat to the school's existence, because without ABA accreditation, students can't take the bar, they can't practice law, and the degree from the school basically becomes worthless. And so these schools need some kind of predictive tool. And right now, the LSAT is the best tool they've got. It's not perfect, of course, but at least it gives the schools some predictive data and lets them filter out applicants who statistically are unlikely to make it through 3 years of law school and pass the bar. I'm not saying there are not exceptions here. Of course, there are some students who bomb the LSAT but can pass the bar and become great attorneys, but all else being equal, the LSAT is a pretty decent predictor of first-year law school grades, and it is correlated with first-year bar passage rates because if you can rock one exam, you're showing you're likely to be able to rock other exams as well. And if schools go entirely test optional and admit tons of students who aren't prepared, even if those students had great GPAs in undergrad, the law school is gambling with the future of their entire institution. And so most of these schools will likely keep using the LSAT. They might explore alternatives, but they're not going to take massive risks. The stakes are just too high. Now, besides the T14 and the low-ranked schools, we've also got schools in the middle. And those are the real wild cards. And that's where things get kind of interesting because the mid-ranked schools, say those ranked in the top 50 to 100 range, specifically schools say 51 to 100, they're in a bit of a tougher spot because they are not elite enough to coast on their school's brand name. They're not a Harvard or a Yale, but they're not desperate enough to take huge risks. At the same time, they are looking for an edge. And these are the schools that might say, let's try it. Let's apply for the variance. Let's go test optional for 10% of next year's class, and we'll see what happens. And so a school in that position might start off with students who have strong GPAs from rigorous undergraduate programs, students who have unique life experiences or backgrounds, students applying to part-time or evening programs. So then the school gathers data. They track those students' performance. They compare the outcomes against those who did apply with an LSAT score. And if the numbers look good, they might expand that policy slowly over time. But don't expect a full pivot away from the LSAT in just a couple of years. Because schools are conservative, they're bureaucratic, they take a wait and see approach. They don't want to bet the farm on some temporary experiment. And so these schools will likely use a more of a hybrid model where they're LSAT optional for some really strong applicants, but they require or prefer the LSAT for most other applicants. And of course, LSAT scores are still tied to scholarships and merit aid. And so if your undergraduate GPA is lower than you might have liked, you still want to take the LSAT to maximize your odds of getting in and getting scholarship money. So if you're still an undergrad, of course, keep juicing it to get the highest GPA possible. But if you're done with undergrad, the LSAT is still a major tool in your arsenal to get better outcomes. So I would still say for you, still apply with the LSAT. And for the schools, from their perspective, they've got to hedge their bets. And so the top schools are going to keep the LSAT because of the rankings. The lowest ranked schools are going to keep the LSAT because they don't want to risk low bar passage rates. And the schools in the middle are the ones who experiment, but they do so cautiously. And so even though the American Bar Association opened the door to go test optional, very few schools are actually going to go wholeheartedly LSAT optional for everybody. I don't think any will actually. Most will kind of look around, wait and see who makes the first move, see what happens for their outcomes and whether it backfires or not. Which brings us back to you as the applicant. If you are applying to law school in the next couple of years, betting on the LSAT disappearing and riding only on your GPA is a pretty risky move. Because while the rules might be changing in theory, nothing major is changing on a widespread scale for everyone yet. So beyond the headlines, the smartest thing you could do in the short term is act as if nothing is changing at all. You should still take the LSAT, even with the ABA's new rule, even if a handful of schools go test optional, even if you hate standardized tests, because the LSAT is not just a test. It is a powerful lever to maximize your odds of admission and maximize your scholarships, because test optional is just a trend, an experiment for a small number of applicants. Most law schools still require or prefer the LSAT because it gives them something concrete, standardized, an equal apples-to-apples comparison across all applicants from different backgrounds. And if you don't have an LSAT score, they're going to look harder at your GPA, your application essays, your letters of rec, your resume. And you want to ask yourself, is that airtight, 100% perfect in every regard? You may not want to have that kind of level of scrutiny on everything else. But if you give them an LSAT score, that's going to be the number one factor in helping them boost their odds boost their standing in the US News rankings. That is a major benefit for them. And it shows them that you are serious about law school, not just applying on a whim. And of course, your GPA is baked in already. It's already pretty set for the most part, unless you're a freshman gunner watching LSAT material way, way earlier than you need to. For most folks who are finishing up undergrad or already out of undergrad, the LSAT is your big chance to stand out in admissions. And it's one of the very few parts that is still in play that can dramatically shift your odds of admission. And it can also get you paid in the form of scholarship money. At most law schools, merit-based scholarships are heavily tied to your LSAT score. And of course, your GPA and your personal statement matter, but nothing moves the needle like a strong LSAT score. And if you look at the law school admission indices, the index formula relating LSAT score to GPA, at nearly every law school, LSAT is weighed more heavily than undergrad GPA because GPAs are so inflated as to be virtually meaningless. Meaning, undergrads give out easy A's, and so law schools don't really know what to make of that. Are you a great undergrad student, or did you just get lucky because your professor was generous? In contrast, the LSAT score is a lot harder to game, and it signals that you're serious about law school, that you're not applying on a whim. You are committed, you planned, and you followed through on your law school goals. And so in a competitive cycle like what we're seeing right now, more people applying than ever before. Application numbers are up 50% over the past 2 years. And so you don't want to miss out on the most powerful tool you have left in your application. The LSAT is the one place you can go from overlooked as an applicant to being overqualified and getting scholarship money. It's your chance to flip the script. And so take the LSAT, crush it, and use it to your advantage.